Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous Richard Reti book Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games one at a time and Reti's analysis of these games. We're continuing to look at the games of Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch, who is playing in the white pieces, and his opponent is Emanuel Lasker, the second world champion, the one who took the title of Steinitz. And this is, I think, actually a World Championship match where Tarrasch was fighting for the World Championship from Lasker. So we'll hopefully see some of what Lasker has to offer, which will sort of be a bit of a teaser for the games to come. Now, before we get started, Reti offers a bit of detail about the Ruy Lopez and a bit about the fielder, but mainly the Ruy Lopez, before the game starts. Now he says that when the Ruy Lopez is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop b5 pinning. Now he says that when we saw Steinitz play against the Ruy Lopez, and often the fielder as well, Steinitz would try and keep the centre very closed. He would often put his pawns on e4, d3 and c3, and we've seen this time and time again. He'd keep the centre very solid, very closed. He wouldn't really fight for a space advantage in the centre. But because the centre is solid, he would then be able to attack on the wings. Similarly, we saw in a previous game by Anderson, where after the Philidor defence with d6, he pushed d4. And this is thought to be the more critical move, the more critical line. Immediately trying to open up the centre whenever d6 is played. And Reti comments that, as a general rule, d4 by white, in e4, e5 games, when black plays d6, you can often play d4 to try and open up the game. However, after black plays knight f6 instead of d6, it can be a bit harder, because then instead of black trying to protect this e5 pawn, they are instead counter-attacking. So if we have a look at, let's say, the Ruy Lopez, bishop b5, knight, so let's play d6 first. So d6, now d4 is a potential option, and this is the old Steinitz defense after d4, and it's known to be a bit better for white here. Now, if instead of d6 black had played knight f6 here, then d4 doesn't really work too well. Well, this does still work, actually. It's not played as often, but it's still an option. The main move here would be to castle. But this is going to the burn defense, and the reason why Reti comments that d4 perhaps isn't as effective is because black isn't really trying to defend this pawn as much as they are trying to get a counter-attack going. So he says that a successful d4 pawn push will often only occur after black has played d6, because knight f6 is attacking the e4 pawn. So white after black takes this e4 pawn, if black takes this e4 pawn, then white will often be able to regain the pawn, but might have a slight advantage due to a slight lead in development, but it would only be a very slight edge. So that's what Reti talks about when it comes to the Ruy Lopez and the Philidor, about pushing d4 when you see d6. Now, in the game, we saw knight f6, knight c6, and bishop b5 going into the Ruy Lopez pinning, and we saw this knight f6. So in the past, we've always seen d6 defending this pawn, but here we're seeing knight f6 counter-attacking the e4 pawn. Now here we castle, if knight takes e4 and d4, and Reti comments that white needs to try and win the pawn they've given up back, but they need to try and do so with very active moves that develop an attack, rather than just trying to move the rook to e1 to try and take the pawn after the knight moves. rather than moving the rook to e1 to try and take this pawn. Potentially have to try to take the knight. Now here we see bishop to e7. It's worth noting this isn't a free pawn because knight takes d4, knight takes d4, e takes d4, rook e1 would pin the knight. So black can't take this pawn. He plays bishop e7, which would stop the pin, and therefore this pawn is now m3. And now we see queen e2 attacking the knight. And it's worth noting the queen goes to e2. So it's not the rook that goes to e1, but it's the queen that goes to e2, because this gives this rook the option of going to d1 or to e1. And that's an important point to know. We'll see why later on. Now here we see knight to d6. We see bishop takes c6, b takes c6. And it's worth noting d takes c6 is sometimes the more natural move, but it doesn't actually work because the rook is able to go to d1. If we see d takes c6, d takes e5, the knight moves, rook to d1, bishop to d7 to block the attack on the queen, and we could see that black's pieces are already quite passively placed, white's pieces are quite active, and white's the one with the advantage here. White's the one with the initiative, white's the one who's able to develop very quickly, very fast, with a strong initiative. If we contrast this, however, instead of queen e2, we saw rook e1, going for the same sort of motive. After knight d6, attacking the bishop, bishop takes, d takes, and now d takes here. Now after knight f5, we could see something like, sorry, it's white's move, queen takes d8. And after bishop takes, we haven't really got anything. White sort of ran out of the attack. This rook to e1 move after the queen had already developed meant that, this rook to e1 move here after the queen had gone to e2, it means that white's able to get the pieces out a lot faster with a lot more initiative and get a lot more activity than black. And that's why with this queen e2, we see after the bishop takes, because it's under attack, we see b takes c6, because taking with the d pawn would allow this rook d1 move after we take the pawn. So here we see d takes e5, knight to b7, knight to c3, castle short, rook to e1. And here Reti comments that black needs to try and play d5 to try and free his position. This pawn on e5 is very restricting of black's position. It's given white a lot of space. White's the one with the central control, so black needs to try and play for this d5 push. Now d5 at the moment doesn't work, and rook e1 is played to prevent d5. Because if we see d5 now, after e takes d6, bishop takes, bishop to g5, we might see something like queen d7 and rook a to d1, and we see again white's pieces are all very actively placed. Black's pawn structure is a bit rubbish. His bishop is stuck behind here. This knight is on a rubbish square, and the rooks are undeveloped. So white has the clear attack, the clear initiative here, and because of that, this rook e1 move means that d5 is just sort of giving black the chance to if black plays d5, it's giving white the chance to get a strong attack going. Now here we see knight to c5, trying to get the knight to e6. We see knight to d4, knight to e6, bishop to e3, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. Note that Tarrasch brought the bishop out so we can get as quick development as possible. And now we see c5, and it's worth noting that this square is potentially weak, especially after d5 and pawn takes at the right moment. This square will be potentially weak. After bishop takes we could potentially get a knight to here. And so Lasker plays this, after this exchanges, Lasker plays this c5 move to try and defend this square. So this square will no longer be that weak because there's a pawn there and that pawn can be defended. And yeah, we'll see perhaps the weakness actually if we see d5 now, after e takes d6, bishop takes d6, now this square is potentially weak. And you might have knight a4, potentially knight c5, or especially if you can trade off this dark square bishop, this knight could get to c5 and live there for forever. So because of that, Lasker plays c5 now to allow d5 in the future. So after bishop e3, well, he now plays d5. You see e takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now we see knight to e4 attacking the bishop, bishop b7, and knight takes d6. These bishops are quite well placed, so Tarrasch is very keen to get rid of the bishop pair and get rid of these very powerful minor pieces. So we see knight takes d6. It's worth noting there are two attackers on this piece, on this pawn, but it doesn't actually win a piece. Sorry, it doesn't actually win a pawn, it loses a piece. Because after knight takes, bishop takes. If we see bishop takes, you might see something like queen g5, which is attacking the bishop and threatening mate. So this wasn't actually a free pawn. And that's why we see knight takes d6. We see c takes d6. And here Reti comments that white is a little bit better. Black's got out the opening, it's not a big advantage at all, but white's a bit better. And the reason for this is black has 3 pawn islands, whereas white only has 2. And black has this weak backwards d6 pawn. So white still has a bit of an advantage because they have the better pawn structure, but black certainly has very good chances to draw, primarily due to the opposite coloured bishops. Now here we see rook a to d1, queen f6, and now c4. So queen f6 was attacking the b2 pawn. We see c4 defending the b2 pawn, and also making this square a bit more of a permanent weakness. White may have had the option previously to try and push d5 and sort of take more control. Sorry, black may be able to push d5, get a bit more control over the centre. So Tarrasch stops this before it becomes a possibility. Now here we see rook f to e8, queen to g4. And it's worth noting that his queen g4 move is quite useful. It sort of gives white, it lets white try and keep the initiative, because black would have quite liked to play queen g6, which would threaten mate, maybe rook e6, something like queen f5, bring the rook up, or potentially double up. So this queen g4 move, it immediately gives white a bit of initiative. Because white's currently threatening queen d7 and infiltrating, it would be a double attack on the bishop and the pawn. So that's the threat, and this threat of queen that exists after queen g4 stops black from being able to get the initiative back. So here we see bishop to c6, stopping queen d7. However, this is a defensive move and it loses a bit of time, which lets white get a bit more initiative. Reti comments that the better move was perhaps rook e6. Defends this weakness, it allows a doubling of the rooks, this rook is ready to swing across if it needs to, and it stops the queen getting to d7. But instead we saw bishop to c6. It's worth noting that in this position, because of this bishop, this pawn isn't actually free, because rook b1 would basically win the bishop. After something like queen c3, you might see rook c1, queen a5, rook takes bishop. So we see bishop to c6, And now rook to e2, and this move stops the rook e6 move, which is the better move. Because if we see rook e6 now, then bishop to g5, attacking the queen after the queen moves out of the way. Rook takes, f takes, and then rook takes d6 would win at the pawn. Obviously, if we have this, we would still win the pawn. So rook e2, the rook's defended by the queen, which makes this bishop g5 move possible. So rook e2 stops the rook e6 move. But we do see rook e4 attacking the queen and also attacking this pawn. And it's defended by the bishop. Now here, white plays queen g3. And now we see queen to e6. And here, Reti offers a bit... So here Reti stops annotating the game himself and looks at one of Tarrasch's previous annotations. And Tarrasch himself commented that this is a surprising move. He was expecting rook takes c4 here, but actually queen e6 threatens now rook g4. And you note that after rook takes c4, you'd have something like rook takes d6 because it's defended by the queen. And then after something like rook to d8, rook takes d8, queen takes d8, h3, white now has the advantage due to the threats of bishop h6 and rook to d2. But it is a very small advantage. It's not a big one, but it's perhaps big enough to pull off a win. So that's what was expected. Tarrasch was expecting this rook takes c4, but instead he got this queen e6, threatening rook to g4. Now here we see h3 defending the back rank, and rook to d6 is an option, and it would have been okay for white. Obviously his pawn is on free, so rook to d6 is an option. But after queen takes c4, rook e to d2, doubling up on the d file and threatening mate, would then see rook g4, and this reply isn't that dangerous now, because after rook d8 check, bishop e8, we might see queen takes, and rook takes, and we've basically got two rooks for the queen. And this position is probably still a bit better for white because black's pawn structure is full of weaknesses, and one of these pawns is likely to fall. But it's probably still a draw with best play. So that was after rook takes d6 here. But instead we see h3 defending the back rank, rook to d8 defending this weak pawn, and now we see rook e to d2 doubling up against this pawn. And now rook to e5, bishop to h6 threatening mate. It's worth noting you can't take this pawn because queen takes e5 would win the exchange, since you can't take back because you would lose instantly. So this bishop isn't actually on free. Now here we see queen to g6 defending the mate threat. Bishop f4 attacking the rook and the pawn. Rook to e6, and now bishop takes d6. And white has won the backwards pawn. So black's weaker pawn structure, we said, gave white a slight advantage, and white now been able to convert that advantage into a material advantage. You see queen to h5, queen to g4, queen takes, h takes, rook to e4, bishop takes c5, and now we see an exchange of rooks, h5 and rook d6, and here Lasker resigned. And the game isn't necessarily completely lost at this point, but it's going to be very hard for Lasker to possibly defend this. Potential continuation might be bishop b7, rook d7, and we're sort of stuck for moves here. Or actually, after bishop b7, perhaps go to here, and then rook d7, because then we'll have an attack on the bishop and an attack on his pawns. With the rook on the 7th rank, it's going to be a one game for white quite easily. So that's why black resigned in this position, because this is just a lost endgame. And that's the game. That's game number 22. I think that's the third game of Tarrasch, and the first game we see of Lasker, and unfortunately a loss of Lasker's, but I'm sure we'll see some decent games of his later on. And so there we have it. We saw how this weak pawn structure here, caused after this knight exchange, was basically what Tarrasch focuses all of his attention on. He doesn't give Lasker the chance to gain any initiative. He makes sure that this weakness stays a weakness. He prevents any attempts to get initiative, and he also plays some prophylactic moves almost. You know, he knew rook e6 was the best move, so he plays rook e2 to prevent it. And then we see how Tarrasch is just able to make some threats and eventually win the pawn weakness. And that was really the turning point of the game, when Tarrasch was able to win this pawn weakness. That was when the game was lost. Yeah, so in this position, black resigned. So there we have it. That's game number 22. I believe the next game might be another French defense, possibly. Yeah, I think it's a French defense next game. So if you like this game, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you for the future Tarrasch videos and future Tarrasch games. Thank you for watching.